to welcome all of you for the book launch today. This book, China's India War. Of course, it seems just a simple reversal of Neville Maxwell's India's China War. So I'm not going to the book, but when you see it, actually it's much more than that. It's not just a rebuttal of Neville Maxwell, but I'll not go to that, but we'll do that. And we have a galaxy of speakers to do that. This is a subject, I think, which has a lot of interest for a lot of us, which is why we had to inconvenience some of you by shifting, but to make it easier for some others to sit. And before going further, let me, of course, request all of you to kind put your mobiles on ringer off. Now, I will not really go into too much detail, but I just want to give some of these things. BErtil Lintner has been working in this part of the world for a long time. He's written a number of books. He's based in Chiang Mai in Thailand. He's worked for the Far Eastern Economic FER for a very long time. He has, I think, 17 books, if I remember correctly, including a book on North Korea. So Jade is great, also on North Korea. So this is a part of the world that he knows really, really well. And therefore, when we ran into each other last year at Singapore, and later he told me he's working on this, and he came to Delhi. I said, you must. If you read this book, this is the place we want you to do it from. And I'm glad he accepted my invitation. Those of you who read the book will find it. I know the vote of thanks comes at the end, which of course Chirag will do. But for me, at least, it's going to be a really great pleasure to welcome. If I look at the panelists here, General J.J. Singh, of course, former chief, but also former governor of Arunachal Pradesh, and who otherwise knows the area very well. We have General Narasimhan, member of our National Security Advisory Board. Again, what should I say, a thinking general, or is that too strong a word? A soldier scholar. Sujit Datta, known for a long time, now at the Jamia, who knows China really, really well. And Nitin Gokhale, who just now in my room, General Malik referred to him as somebody who doesn't wear a uniform but knows as much about the army as anybody in OG. So we have a galaxy of people here, and it's so good to see this turnout. This is a biggish hall, 300-seater. Normally you do our book releases up there, unless it's a political type of book. The fact that so many of you are here, let me welcome you again. Really warm. We feel very honored that you people have come here for this very important book launch. And let me not take more of your time, but once again request you to please put your phones on, because our phones do have a terrible habit of ringing at the wrong time. So let me now ask BErtil to introduce the book, and then each of our four panelists will speak for about 8 to 10 minutes each. I'll request them to speak for 8 to 10 minutes, because we really then want to get into a discussion mode. This is a book, I think, which needs a serious amount of discussion. Once again, welcome, and BErtil, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you everybody for coming. I'm very surprised at this huge crowd and this interest in this book. And you may wonder, why did I write a book about the 1962 war and the border conflict with China? Aren't there enough books about that already? Well, when I looked at the literature that's available now, I can say that it falls into three categories. The first are a number of books, and very good books, written by Indian Army officers who took part in the war in 1962. And those books are very interesting. There's military history. It shows where the war was fought, how it was fought, and how the battles went. But they seldom contain any kind of geopolitical context for the war, and therefore I felt it needed something more than that. The other category are more scholarly works on the border issue, old treaties, maps, and so on. And there is a fundamental flaw in that approach to the entire problem. I mean, here in India, you have a very legalistic approach to everything. The law is important, treaties are important, the courts are very powerful. In China, it's entirely different. Any kind of treaty that was signed a long time ago, which they don't like, is dismissed as an unequal treaty, because they would say they was forced upon China when China was weak. But even in modern times, when China is strong, the attitude hasn't changed. And actually, after I written that book, I came across a very interesting article in the South China Morning Post, Hong Kong daily newspaper. And it's about the 1984 Sino-British Joint Declaration about the future of Hong Kong, which reverted to Chinese rule in 1997. It was agreed upon at that time that Hong Kong should enjoy full autonomy for 50 years. But this is what Lu Kang, a spokesman for the Chinese Foreign Ministry, said in June this year. He said that the Sino-British Joint Declaration, 1984, is a historical document that no longer has any realistic meaning. It also does not have any binding power on how the Chinese central government administers Hong Kong. So even that treaty has been repudiated. And if you look at when a dispute in the South China Sea was addressed by international judicial bodies, and they ruled in the favor of the Philippines, China simply called it an unfair judgment. China doesn't follow international rules and regulations. They don't honor treaties. And if they ever do, if they ever quote an old treaty, it's because they think that would strengthen their cause. But they're also very picky about that, because they would choose only the sentences which are in their favor, which was, of course, as all of you know, the case when things flared up in Doklam a few months ago. The title of this article is "Why China's Record in Honoring Historical Agreements Smacks of Cherry Picking." And I think this is very important to remember when we look at any kind of study of the border issue, about border treaties, and so on, because they don't mean anything to China. China does what it thinks is best for their strategic interests, and treaties have no bearing at all. The third category of books are those the kind of books which said that the 1962 war was provoked by Nehru's forward policy, and therefore India was to blame for the war. And of course, the most important book in that category is Neville Maxwell's Indus-China War. But the more I read that book, the more I looked at the whole issue, and the more I actually studied the realities on the ground in Arunachal Pradesh, which was then Nepal, of course, where the war was fought, apart from in the western sector. I found that this doesn't make sense. The forward policy was announced in November 1961. Are we to believe that in less than a year, China was able to mobilize tens of thousands of troops, and we're talking about 1962 now, move them through the most difficult terrain in the world, including heavy military equipment, and not only troops, also road construction crews, which came after the troops when they captured Bumla on the border. They were working around the clock, 24 hours, to build a road down to Taiwan. And when General John Delvey was captured by the Chinese and held prisoner of war, he was taken to a camp which could house 1,000 POWs. They already built tents for the prisoners, and they brought in interpreters who could speak in a variety of Indian languages. Before the 1962 war, the Chinese already made contacts with the rebels from the Naga Hills, then already become Nagaland in the east, and had promised them support. So did this really have anything to do with the border? I think that the misjudgment that Maxwell made, and I think most people made at the time, was that in 1962, China was an extremely secretive country. It was closed. We didn't know what was happening in China at that time. Maybe Neville Maxwell's book had been different if he had known what the state of affairs were in China was in the early 1960s. Because in the late 1950s, Mao Zedong launched what he called the Great Leap Forward. He was going to modernize China, bring it into the modern world, industrialize China. It was a complete disaster. We don't know how many people died during that famine that ensued. It could have been 30 million, it could have been 40 million people. Mao Zedong's position in the Communist Party, in China the Communist Party is more important than the government and the military, was shaky, to say the least. In that kind of situation, what country will go to war over a disputed border? only a country or a leader of a country who needs to unite the party, the government, and the military behind him to be able to reconsolidate his grip on power. And that is exactly what Mao Zedong did in 1962. So the question is, why India then? Well, remember that in 1959, the Dalai Lama fled to India, was given refuge here. He was first in Missouri and then went up to Meklalganj near Dehradun. So it was very easy to say that India, that's the enemy. And then we got this border thing also. We can always say that that's the problem. Because in the early 50s, mid-50s, the Chinese never talked about the border. They came only towards the late 1950s. And I believe that the decision to go to war against India was taken in 1959, so several years before the forward policy and so on. Because you will need at least 3 years to make preparations for that kind of war. Because what is extremely interesting, which I was able to find out only by traveling in Arunachal, where did the Chinese cross the border? Which areas did they target? There's this general belief that they overran the whole of Nepal. They didn't really. In the west, they captured Tawang. They came down to Bumdilla, to Rupa, and stopped somewhere between Rupa and Balagpong, which is on the Assam border. Then there was a small area in central Nepal, not very far, not very deep, into the territory. And then in the east, Wallong. But that was it. What do these areas have in common? Well, the people there speak various kinds of Tibetan dialects. I'm not suggesting that people there cooperated with the Chinese. But we're talking about the late 50s now, the early 60s. This is before satellite surveillance and the radar intercepts and all that sort of thing. China depended on human intelligence. And it's quite clear from the coordination of the war, the way it was carried out, they had extensive knowledge of the terrain. And they could only got that from sending in spies years before they decided to attack. And they depended on human intelligence for almost everything before the troops came across the border. You can see that very clearly at the Battle of the Sela Pass, for instance, where they came from behind and attacked. And in Wallong, the Indian army had already retreated onto the plains and were gone. But never they stopped at the river. When I was up there, I said, what people live on this side of the river? What people live on the other side of the river? Well, north of the river, there was the people who spoke a Tibetan dialect. South was Mishmis, hostile Mishmis as far as the Chinese were concerned. They had not collected any intelligence from that area. And who were these spies? And well, a lot of Chinese do speak Tibetan. And we must remember also that not all Tibetans are loyal to the Dalai Lama. They had a fair chunk of the population on the side as well, who've been trained as spies, as human intelligence assets. So all this points at the fact that this was a well-prepared operation, which had nothing really to do with the border. And if you look at it in a more sort of global perspective, why it was important for China to attack India in 1962. Well, in the 1950s, India was the leading voice for the newly independent countries in Asia and Africa. Nehru was the statesman who was, you can say, at the forefront of this kind of new awareness that was emerging in this part of the world. India initiated the Bandung Conference, the non-aligned movement and all that. China was not really a big player at all. It was India that brought China to Bandung. And maybe at Bandung the Chinese discovered that, okay, we could do something, similar and take over India's role here. But they, of course, eventually did, because we have two fundamentally different cultures here. We have Nehru in India, the non-aligned movement, and we have Mao Zedong, the revolutionary. His theory was the three worlds theory, that the world was divided into three different categories, you could say. The superpowers, then he meant the United States and the Soviet Union, the lesser powers, and the rest of the world, primarily the poor countries, and then poor countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. He wanted to become the leader of the third world. And in order to become that, he had to dethrone India from that position, from having the moral high ground in that part of the world. And if you look at what happened after the war, that's exactly what it turned out to be exactly the way Mao Zedong wanted it. China became the leader of all the revolutionary forces in the Third World. Nero died a broken man 2 years after the war, and India's position as the conscience of the Asia and Africa was gone. Of course, Mao Zedong managed to reassert his grip on power after 1962, the war. He bounced back with a vengeance. There were still some people left there he wanted to get rid of. So a couple of years later, he launched the great proletarian cultural revolution. And after that, he was an undisputed helpsman, the leader of China, the leader of the Third World, and all its revolutionary movements. So this is what I'm describing in the book. And not only that, I try to also go into the situation today that actually not that much has changed. Well, China doesn't export revolution any longer. China exports consumer goods, and they're flooding the world with consumer goods, and they're buying up minerals from all over the world. But they still have this notion that they want to dominate, they want to become a superpower, if not the leading superpower. And that is what's going to cause conflicts and frictions with other countries in the world. And that's a conflict, I'm not talking about armed conflict here. It's a clash of interests, and it's a build-up of a new Cold War in Asia, I would say, with China on one side, and an informal alliance consisting of India, Japan, the United States, Australia, France, very informal on the other. And they all worried about the rise of China and the expanding power of China. With China, most of China's trade with the outside world actually goes through the Indian Ocean. They get all the oil from the Middle East, and most of their oil, not all of it, but most of it. They get a lot of minerals from Africa, and the exports to Africa and to Europe pass through the Indian Ocean. You hear about this OBOR thing, the One Belt, One Road. They're going to revive all trade routes, right? Well, there was a land route, yes, the Silk Road. But a maritime Silk Road? What's that? When the last time Chinese ships ever went into the Indian Ocean was in the 15th century, when Cheng He, who was a Muslim eunuch from Yunnan, sailed with fleets of junks to India, to Southeast Asia, and to Africa. But he was more of an adventurer than a tradesman. But after that, China lost interest in the oceans. China never had a navy, apart from patrol boats for the rivers to suppress banditry and rebellions in their own country. Now, for the first time, China is developing a blue water navy, for the first time in history. And there's never been an Indian Ocean for 600 years. And this is where I end the book, really, that I don't think there's going to be a war in the Himalayas. But if it's going to be, excuse me, any conflict with China, and I'm not talking about an armed conflict, it's going to be in the Indian Ocean. So the basic problems still remain. Is China, which has its own interpretation of world affairs, but they want to be a leader, before the revolution, a leader, not that type of leader, and the rest of the world watching this development with increased concern. Thank you.
Thank you, BErtil, for that introduction to the book and your main things. Now I think can I request all the dignitaries here, let's do the unveiling of the book. For the first panel speaker of the day, I request General J.J. Singh, who himself has been doing a lot of research in this area, and hopefully his book shall be coming out soon. So, General Singh, can I request you to...
Good evening, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. It's indeed a great privilege for me to address such an august gathering. Also, I'm very privileged to be here and speaking on the book by a very distinguished author, BErtil Lintner. He's written a number of books, but what I would like to highlight is that he's one of those scholars who's actually physically trudged on very, very difficult terrain and walked kilometers upon kilometers, maybe thousands of them. And also he's married to a lady from Shan province, which is on the east of the Kachins, and also it is bordering with Yunnan. Very troubled area, but he has explained everything in his book. So I would like to say he is one person who can speak with authority because he has not only studied and researched, but also met people, got first-hand information, also walked physically. That makes a lot of difference as compared to scholars who have been studying, researching, but have not got the advantage of knowledge of the geopolitics, the terrain, so which is very important. I will start off by saying I have been privileged to spend 1 week of my adult life, practically mathematically speaking, in the Northeast. I was governor in Arunachal for 5.5 years. Before that, I was commanding a battalion in Wolong area, which is bordering with Myanmar, and the Lohit Valley. Wolong is bordering there, and it figures very prominently in our relations with China. Also, I have been in Nagaland for 4.5 years on the beginning of my career, where he has actually trudged across those borders clandestinely once and officially a number of times. So BErtil is one of those. I'm happy that the government of India was kind to him and allowed him to carry on his adventures, but he has actually written a wonderful book. He has also studied the tribal societies. There's also these countries which are, if you draw a circle around Guwahati, 1,000 kilometers radius, you'll get 7-8 countries. So therefore, let's not call Northeast India Northeast. It's the center of that part of India. In all these countries come in a sphere of influence. We have to understand Guwahati, Shillong becomes the center. So kindly refocus and look at it from that point of view. The people are wonderful people. I want to just mention, I'm very privileged also to have fostered a young man from Nagaland. He was 10-year-old. He's James Kalengto, an Angami. Please stand up, James. He's today a soldier in the Indian Army. He's in Assam regiment. But he's done very well, studied in Army Public School here and later on went on. He's one of the only students of Army Public School who's joined as a soldier. Or rather, his elder brother, Foster Kuljit, was the first. Okay. He knows Angamis very well, and he is also my guru as far as my knowledge of Angami culture and others concerned, because you must perhaps be aware, Fizo was a Angami, and so was General Mau, Tinusili, all the leadership. There are two clans which dominated all this, was the Angami clan and the Sima clan. So my upbringing in the military was in Nagaland for 4.5 years, from 65 to 69. I also went across the border, very close to the border. We can always say is a fuzzy line, because once you are on the famous Patkoi range in Saramati area, forest is so dense you don't know whether, and we didn't have GPSs then. In 81, we did an operation, Trans-Border, which today people talk about. We didn't talk then, but I was very happy. My battalion was decorated. I was decorated in that operation in 1981 as a colonel. So I have a lot of knowledge of that area for the simple reason that I got posted again and again by the military secretary's branch. I must tell you a joke. If they post you repeatedly in one place, they say, you know that area, so we're sending you. And if they don't send you there, they say, we want to give you a balanced career profile. So both ways they are right when nobody can point a finger at them. Coming to issues which he has raised, firstly, the Chinese. I think where we went wrong, and what he's pointed out very brilliantly, is that we should get under their skin. We should know the Chinese. We should know their psyche. We don't understand the dragon and his, the Middle Kingdom syndrome. We should know it. Of course, it is also undergoing changes, but then you have to be so good that to be able to read between the lines and see the fine print and then say, yes, this is what has changed. Because the approach of the leadership in the 50s and 60s was different from the approach of the leadership today. So let's not use the same parameters for what their leadership is going to do today or in the future as what Mao and Chou En-lai did. I also now mention that Chinese have always got an excuse, oh, those treaties are unequal, unfair. So therefore, we don't have to go by them. We will do what we think is correct. But that's basic selfish national interest. Okay, that goes in every issue which we discuss of them. Look into it and you get the answer what I said. They're opportunistic also. When we gave them in 1899 a line that you can accept this line, which the British government of the day gave them along the Karakoram range, they didn't reply. So that was suddenly off the table in the next discussion because the British said, sorry, you didn't accept it. That offer is not anymore there. But that would have given them the Aksai Chin. But they didn't take it then because they were thinking that something else would come their way. But I will also mention that the Chinese were never present in Arunachal Pradesh ever, except for 1 or 2 forays in 1910 and 12, when their General Chao Feng was the butcher of Tibet, and he came up, and some of his troops came up to just the touch fringes of the tribal territory, but they didn't ever come in. So they have no claims whatsoever. Talking about Tawang is again very interesting. Dr. Lintner has mentioned in his book that it's not very clear, but I think I would like to say here, it's very abundantly clear when the McMahon line was drawn. Tawang was a monastery which is very famous after the Lhasa monastery is there. The sixth Dalai Lama came from there. So therefore, that was decided that it will be on the Indian side of the line of control because the ridge line where Bumla is a border pass is north of it, and between Sonazong and Tawang there are about 50 kilometers. It's in between them, and the ridge line is the most prominent ridge line. So that is why I would like to beg your pardon for saying that, but there is a clarity over there, and the McMahon line talks and shows Tawang written in the ideograms south of the line. I'll also very quickly say who provoked the war. I can tell you the 62 war was, India was just naive and gullible enough to give them the provocation or the trigger, but they were all prepared. How can in 9 months or 6 months or even 2 months, some people go to the extreme limit, October they decided to attack? No, they were preparing for it for 3 years. And they couldn't have had a Tamil-speaking interpreter on the border, Punjabi-speaking guy, Bengali-speaking guy. They had all prepared. They were all there right in the front in the war time, making propaganda, speaking to our soldiers to demoralize them and all that in their local language. I also say that with China, we have to be very clear. We have to study. In my research, I came across Dalai Lama the 13th who said, watch them carefully. If they take a step and you don't say anything, then they take a second one, and the third one will be to their objective. What we did in Doklam was for the first time in a place where they didn't expect. Of course, before that also, in 67, we took a very strong stand in the Nathula area. And also, I can say that in Daulat Beg Oldie, that Depsang Bulge area, these names come to me because I've been living this border. I've walked 1,000 kilometers on the McMahon line, so I can say with authority, when there were no roads, we used to walk. But this area is extremely difficult and not so well recce'd. But hats off to 2 captains, Bailey and his colleague. 2 of them went in 6 months and covered almost to 3,000 kilometers and came down to Rangya. They entered the Tibet side of the watershed of the Himalayas in the area from Mipi, Anini, that's the Debang Valley. What they did was to give the entire geography from the other side. They surveyed it with the rudimentary instruments of those times. You can give them credit for doing it, but they walked 15-20 kilometers average per day to be able to do that journey because they did it. And in Tawang area, they went up and down twice. What I'm saying is that this book has highlighted some of the very fine points, and because of his experience here, I think none of us here has lived in those remote areas where he has lived. and with a very small newborn child, how they cross the Patkoy range. BErtil, you should get a Nobel Prize for that. Okay, it's been a wonderful experience reading this book of his, and I've read his earlier one, Great Game East. I think he is one of the finest exponents of what is going on in our Northeast, a sensitive area, and I'll be very happy to share with you. We caught the first big gang, which is described in his book, of General Mao Angami and Isaac Su. They went to China. They trekked for they came back in 76 days because they were given a bus ride for half the way. Otherwise, they took 96 days. He's written it also. He's got the information correct. They trekked and reached the Chinese training areas near Kunming. And he's mentioned the name of the place, which is also absolutely correct as per my records. And I think the Chinese trained them. The first thing they told them when they were tired and fatigued, all right, you're all, what religion you believe? Okay, pray to your God to give you food. No, those fellows are so hungry, famished, tired, whatever you can say, exhausted. They prayed like good Christians. They prayed, and the others who were not Christian, they prayed to their own God. They gave no food to them. They said, now please request Chairman Mao Zedong. And then they were given a lavish spread after that because they prayed to Mao Zedong, or they took his name. And this is one book they gave each one of them. I'm keeping it for so many years, more than 30, 40 years. This is Mao's Red Book. Each one was given to carry this, and each young man was carrying 30 kilograms of metal, bombs, rockets, ammunition, and everything. They also had this book because we got it from them. They also had opium because if the food runs out, have opium and carry on. They reached in a very bad shape. They came into a camp. We lured them into a camp. This was the finest operation of 8 Mountain Dev in Nagaland in 68, 69 when I was also there. And these people were allowed to go into the camp. We surrounded it. They surrendered. Unfortunately, all the things which China gave them, all the weapons, equipment, and ammunition and everything was on the platter for us. No casualties, but we got them all because they didn't have the stamina to fight after that. So with this, I will just say there are many more things. Shortage of time. I have taken 10 minutes, BErtil, and Shakti, you must be noting the time. I'm finishing now. During tea break or sometime later, we'll talk again. There's so much to talk. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your time.
Thank you very much, General Singh. No, it was always good to listen to somebody who knows the terrain as well as the author does. Now let me turn it over to General Simon.
Good evening to you all, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. This book probably couldn't have come at a better time than this. And the reason I say that is this book beautifully weaves what happened pre-62 till what is happening now. And it is divided into 8 chapters, as some of you would have seen the book. What I intend to do in the next 10 minutes is to highlight the salient issues related to this book and related to India-China relations. The chapter 1 actually describes how the planning for 62 has started long before what was already given out in various publications. And the aim, it says, is to dislodge India from the pedestal of the non-aligned movement and to emerge as a replacement to that particular country and as a leader amongst the developing nations. And many of you would have realized in 1960, the relationship between USSR and Chinese were at a very low level. The engineers, etc., who were supporting China went back. And it was also a way to convey to USSR that China is a force to reckon with. The internal situation in China, which has been described very beautifully in this book, based on the 100 Flowers Bloom, based on the other socialist kind of initiative that Mao Zedong had initiated at that time, had brought down Mao's power to such a level that he needed to reinvent himself and re-emerge the leader of China. And it also very clearly states the kind of dislike that Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai had built up over a period of time towards Mr. Nehru. And lastly, in this chapter, the biggest takeaway is that the misunderstanding that India had a hand in anything that happened with Tibet or the Tibetan uprising is something which has carried on, not only around that time, it carries on till today. So this is how this chapter 1 develops as to what were the reasons and how this entire war was prepared and then orchestrated. The chapter 2 deals with the line. Basically, there are a number of lines that we discuss when we discuss the India-China boundary. One is the Ardagh-Johnson line, McCartney-McDonnell line. These things are very clearly given in this book. And in addition to that, what this chapter clearly brings out is that this 1962 war is not about resolving the boundary. It is not about resolving that boundary line. It is basically the reasons which I explained to you earlier. And we talk about two-front war today. And this book talks about two-front war around that time. So there is a string that goes through this to say that this two-front war is nothing new, and this has started way back 5 decades ago. And it also talks about Tibet's stand, and His Holiness Dalai Lama's stand presently is almost the same. Though Tibet was independent earlier, they were willing to go with the Chinese as long as their traditions, customs, etc. were protected. The same is the stance even today. However, the Chinese view of His Holiness Dalai Lama has not changed over a period of time. The way these lines were discussed, and the Chinese representative initiated this particular agreement in 1914, Shimla Agreement, has been very clearly explained as to how he was a standby who came in for discussions because the person who was supposed to be there couldn't reach that particular place where they were to discuss. And how this entire thing came about, whether there would have been a support to Mao Zedong from Zhou Enlai and others who were supporting Sanhe Yishao. Sanhe Yishao was 3 peaceful acts and 1 reduction. 3 peaceful acts is reconciled to USA, USSR and India and reduce the revolutionary support that they were supposed to give to the world's revolutionary forces. So this is how the chapter 2 pans out to say that how the line was arrived and how various actors played into this particular game and how things evolved because of this line. Chapter 3 talks about the invasion itself, and that talks about the preparation for PLA that has been done. He mentioned it, Dr. Lintner mentioned it in his talk, that the Chinese intelligence agencies were very active in Arunachal Pradesh and other areas, and they had clear knowledge of the terrain, the deployment, etc., so that they could actually do the job very comfortably. And it also explains very clearly how they did not extend their offensive beyond a point where they didn't have the knowledge of the terrain, etc. They went up to that place alone, and then they went back. It also talks about the kind of experiences the PLA soldiers had in Tibet those days. He talks about Sergeant Li Weihang's experience of interacting with the Tibetans there who felt that they were going into a different country, and how the Tibetans were comfortable dealing with Indian prisoners than to deal with the Chinese soldiers. So it clearly gives out an indication that the status of Tibet with respect to China was something different than what China perceived. The next chapter talks about after the war, how things have panned out. There are about 14 kind of incidents or 14 kind of things that took place after the war I could count in this book. But what I would like to add to that is, it left in India a syndrome, which I call as 92 syndrome, which carried on for a pretty long time. We have got over it, but it carried for a pretty long time. And the abdication of non-alignment, both by India and China, after the 62 war, because of the 62 war, has been explained very beautifully in this book. the support to Indian insurgent groups, which General J.J. Singh talked about and Dr. Lintner talked about, we all know that it was there earlier. There is a string again which goes through this. And that string is, even at that time, the Chinese were actually looking at the numbers. Do the insurgent groups have those numbers so that they can support them, so that they can create some kind of a disturbance within the Indian territory? I bet they're looking at it even today. So this is something, a string that runs through the entire book. The next chapter deals with Sikkim and how Chumbi Valley was important to them and how Chumbi Valley is important to them today. And we all know what happened in Dolam. I don't want to talk about it because of the time constraint. We can talk about it later somewhere. Sikkim, again, he built it up from the history part of it as to how Sikkim evolved itself into a state and how it became part of China, India, and how the events have developed beyond that. And as far as Bhutan is concerned, he clearly mentions that Bhutan has been one country that has been able to retain its independence steadfastly. He talks about Nepal. He talks about the Maoist insurgency. He talks about the inroads that China is making into Nepal, and how the Mustang camp was dismantled. Those details give a clear indication as to how Chinese were interested in Nepal then and how Chinese are interested in Nepal now. And the last chapter talks about the border regions and oceans, where he talks about the water diversion from Brahmaputra, the Indian Ocean region, and the Arunachal Pradesh, and the developments that are taking place in the Arunachal Pradesh. As far as Brahmaputra river diversion is concerned, this is not a new project that emerged now. It has been Chinese have been talking about it from the 1950s actually. And the methodology has been varying. There are 2 diversion projects today in China. One starts from the Yangtze River upwards. There are 3 alignments to that east, center, and the west. There's another one that is being talked about, which came out very recently in South China Morning Post. That came about, which said that this 1,000-kilometer-long tunnel is what is being planned about, which is quite emphatically denied by the officials next day itself. But the fact of the matter is, when you read the Chinese media reports in Chinese language, you get a feeling that something is on in the offing as far as this is concerned. So we are aware of it, and we keep monitoring it quite clearly. And as I said, this book could not have come at a better time than this. And I enjoyed reading this book a lot, and I hope all of us enjoy reading this book and take very valid lessons from this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, General. Thank you, Ananthaman. I now request Professor Sujit Datta.
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak here. I have read this book of BErtil Lintner with immense interest because the book, in many ways, I think has a landmark quality to it, mainly because of the kind of approach that's taken to address the India-China question as a central feature of a new kind of great game. So unlike the Anglo-Russian great game that was played out in the mid-19th century, early 20th century, today's new great game has similar qualities to it, and it's all about increasing interest and clash of interests across the Himalayas based on one principal driving factor, and that is growing Chinese ambition to control events around its periphery, dominate it, and shape it along its own thinking. Today, in this context, the debate over 1962, which has sharply been divisive in a way because of ideological factors that went into many of the analysis, both on the left as well as on the Anglo-American writing post-1970s, when in the context of America's rapprochement with China, is very revealing. And I think BErtil Lintner's work does a very important service in terms of laying out the problem in a larger context and placing some of the works of that time in a more critical light with the history of the previous 60 years as a help to elaborate many of these things. So I congratulate BErtil Lintner for writing this book. This book is very valuable and needs to be read widely. I'll just highlight a few things that strikes me as of great importance. The first is that, as you know, for a long time, particularly after the 1970s, Neville Maxwell's basic argument, that it was India that provoked the war, the revisionist kind of formulation, has held sway strongly among many quarters, and it became particularly the accepted wisdom in much of Western academic literature, with impact, of course, on the literature of other countries in terms of analyzing the 1962 war and the consequences thereafter. In fact, a whole set of arguments were thereafter created depending on which side of the Cold War India was and which side of the Cold War China was. Now, there was an interesting work that one of my colleagues, Sanjay Singh Yadav, did. He's here in this audience. Well, he was in IDSA and did his PhD on this topic and showed very clearly that the same set of data, using the same set of data, two entirely different conclusions were arrived at by Anglo-American writing, in particular on the Sino-Indian War, and that this is essentially of a period that is pre-rapprochement, US-China rapprochement, and post-US-China rapprochement. So, for example, all the data regarding forward policy, the question of absence of any treaty in the Ladakh sector between India and China or India and Tibet, or the question of the Shimla Agreement's validity of 1913-14 Shimla Agreement's validity, in which the McMahon Line was agreed to, all were available as basic information to the writers in the 1960s. And they came to the conclusion, the broad conclusion was that Chinese Communist Party in power as the PRC was essentially a continuation of old Chinese imperial thinking as far as territory and notions of spheres of influence, as well as how to secure borders and peripheries are concerned, and that this was being played out in the India-China context, and it was essentially a Chinese-initiated conflict. This entire interpretation changed dramatically post-1970s, roughly, beginning with British analysis, and thereafter took off with American analysis, 1971-72 onwards, when in the context, when the entire approach of the United States and Britain changed towards China as a result of the rapprochement and the fact that hereafter China would be on the American side of the Cold War and not on the other side. And so the interpretation here became radically reoriented, revisionist in its nature. And it's in this context that Neville Maxwell's book came out in 1971, becoming, in a way, the symbolic writing of this period. And it's continued well into the 70s, 80s, this period during which US-China rapprochement was the defining feature of the Cold War. So BErtil Lintner's important contribution, I think, here is a firm critique, a good critique of the kind of methodology that Maxwell did, and particularly the way some of the reports, etc., Henderson Brooks' report, for example, have been used to come to conclusions. In fact, what Maxwell says, as Henderson Brooks' critique of, from the Indian Army's report point of view of the forward policy, etc., cannot be borne out by fact. It doesn't talk about it, and many of the interpretations and the footnotes, etc., do not seem to bear out what actually the report says. So, in many ways, I think a lasting contribution in that kind of analysis and debate for this book is a critique of both Alistair Lamb's work on the McMahon line, on which so much of Maxwell's work depended, and secondly, on Maxwell's own methodology and work himself, finding fault with India for taking positions, while for the same, he doesn't find any problems with the Chinese position. After all, Nehru did broach the topic with Zhou Enlai in 1954 about about Chinese maps and claims, and to settle these issues, Zhou Enlai said there are really no problems. They are old maps. We are still settle it. We are going through it. And then in 1959, suddenly the Chinese make huge claims on areas that had never been occupied, were never part of any Chinese empire, never part of the Qing Empire, and certainly not part of the Republic of China, which had no capacity to govern Tibet, and Tibet had declared independence in 1913 and exercised it well into 1950. So a kind of analysis was used, which has unfortunately had a major impact on intellectual thinking and international relations writing for many, many years, and that, thankfully, would have an important burial as a result of works like BErtil Lintner, because not that Indians did not do that work. Many fine writings did take place. K. Subramanian and others have done a lot of work critiquing Maxwell's position. T. Murthy's work on Alistair Lamb, etc., have made important contribution, but unfortunately, the international opinion is deeply still shaped by what goes on in Western writings, and since his BErtil Lintner's antecedents are from Europe, they would have some impact on that debate, I believe. The second point, I think that's to be noted here, is that unlike a typical diplomatic, analytical writing on this subject, what BErtil Lintner has done is bring in much wider canvas for analyzing the way India-China relations are playing out through the Himalayas, and in which domestic politics of these countries and foreign policy intermix and interplay with diplomacy. And so he has detailed chapters on Nepal, Bhutan's, China itself, on Burma, to show the forces that are evolving and how Chinese and Indian diplomacy plays into those political forces, each trying to shape it according to their interest, and how this entire situation, therefore, has immense amount of uncertainty built into it because of the fact that so much of the politics of these countries is self-unstable and unsettled. So, and it is in this that the tussle and struggles for influence and power is taking place. So that I think also, and in some ways, therefore, it's not only a book about India-China relations, it also has immense analytical value as far as analysis of parts of South Asia, and particularly the Indian subcontinent's mountainous regions are concerned, in a larger scholarly terrain. A third factor which needs, I think, to be mentioned is the fact that BErtil has located the India-China relationship in a larger great game, an evolving great game in which historic mistrust and current competition play out. It has to do with border disputes in the Himalayas, the competition and influence in Nepal, Bhutan, Myanmar, cross-border insurgencies, the sharing of river water resources, and strategic rivalries in the Indian Ocean. So that means it's now gradually, as the scope of India's trade and China's trade and investments and the overall growth of these countries play out and are inevitably going to shape the nature of Asia in the coming decades, they no more are playing out only on the Himalayas. They have much wider canvas and certainly have moved on to the seas and maritime maritime routes through which trade, energy, and others flow, and simultaneously military building to back it up. And this is an important feature of today's evolving strategic environment in Asia. Now, one of the important factors that emerge from this, of course, is, he briefly mentions the quadrilateral that is being in shape, but what remains is to be noted here is very clearly China's rise has huge impact on Asia. And the Chinese are not coy about it anymore. As you know, the Xi Jinping's characteristic feature, the so-called new phase in Chinese foreign policy, or new phase of China's politics in marking its rise, is essentially about a break with the past. And that is, China will no more play a role of a supplicant or no more play a role that was advised by Deng Xiaoping saying, bide your time, lie low. Instead, it will be an assertive power, that is, time has come, arrival of its role as a great power has come, and it will assert its interests. It is in this context, therefore, the India-China relationship and the great game here merges with a much larger feature based on China's emerging role in Asia and what it is doing throughout East, Southeast, and the Indian Ocean, going right up to Africa. And it is in this larger context that the India-China relationship will be caught, and in which Japan, United States, and Southeast Asian countries will inevitably be drawn in and have already been drawn in. And therefore, there's an uncertainty built into what is going on in post-2012 Xi Jinping period in Asia as China begins to assert its interest and believes that it can get past it by maneuvering without getting into a major war. How far that Xi Jinping will be able to be successful in managing to push China's interest without getting involved in a larger war or a larger conflict remains to be seen. But it creates the conditions where arms race and immense power politics is certainly going to be a driving feature of relations in Asia as a result of the rise of China and its particular kind of approach that's taken. Finally, I commend this book also for very interesting analysis and anecdotes of typical, I think, journalists' very important contribution to the writing of a scholarly work is the interplay of human interest and such very interesting observations which normal scholarly works do not have, or much drier. It's a live book. He has traveled across the theory, has met people, he quotes them, he brings in the fate of the Chinese community in Kolkata and Darjeeling and elsewhere during the 1962 war. It's got a great human interest value, which I'd liked very much, and therefore I'm very happy that this book has been done. It'll play a very important role in terms of putting things in place, and certainly will have an impact both on media coverage, the notions that the journalists have in our country regarding foreign policy issues, as well as academia. Thank you.
Thank you, Sudhir. Before I ask Nitin to speak, For those of your friends who are not here and wish they were here, no, we'll still have one more speaker to go. Those of your friends who are not here and want to know, we are live streaming this on Facebook, on the NNML Facebook page. Nitin Gokhale, who's just written a book on securing India. So if you want to know about cross-border activities, Nitin is the man for you. Over to you, Nitin.
Thank you, Shakti. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. As the last speaker on the stage here, that is, last speakers always have a challenge. That all needs to be said and all needs to be done has been done. So what is left for me to say, really? But I'll speak not so much on the scholarly contents of the book, but what this book is likely to do, in my own view, because having lived and reported the Northeast between 1983 and 2006, I've always looked at the Northeast as a stepping stone towards Southeast Asia, when it was not even on the horizon in Delhi or in anybody's mind really, in the popular perception, at least in the media and otherwise. And therefore, BErtil's book is an important milestone in the popular literature on India-China, as well as a scholarly work, because it makes 2 points very clear. One, it debunks Neville Maxwell and Alistair Lamb's in theory on the 1962 conflict or the India-China contestation in the 50s and the 60s, which I think was very much needed, because the influence, the disproportionate influence that Neville Maxwell and Alistair Lamb have had on the history of Indian subcontinent post-1947 needed some kind of a similarly more authoritative, I would say not similar, but more authoritative work from somebody who has lived in that place, who has traveled, and who has done extensive research like BErtil has done. So I think that's one of the important achievements of this book, that hopefully the shadow of Maxwell and Lamb will be removed from the minds of the scholars on China and Pakistan. Especially Lamb's work on Pakistan should also be now critically looked at, like he has done on Maxwell, where he has very rightly looked at the text and tried to match it with the end notes and the notes there that Maxwell had, which really didn't match, which is rightly pointed out. Some of us had looked at it and we thought that how do we debunk that? But he's made that task very clear. The other interesting aspect is, I think has been spoken about, but worth repeating, that Mao used the contest with India and the war with India to do two things: to purge his likely rivals in the party and consolidate his position in the early 60s, which is very evident now that we read the book, because he's not only cited literature, not only cited records, but has also spoken about various party meetings of the Communist Party of China. The meeting in Shanghai, for instance, where they actually decided in 1959 to teach India a lesson. Now, that could be then looked at or we're about to climb because of the non-aligned movement and the Western education that India's first Prime Minister had, and the acceptance that he had, seemingly had in the world. So that he has actually put it in a context that why Mao did it, and is rightly said that it was not, the war was not about the border itself or the line itself. The line is still being contested, the border is still being contested, and therefore it is an important assertion and important point that has been proven in this book with adequate research and backup. Similarly, his chapters on Sikkim, Bhutan, Nepal, which has been talked about, I think need much more careful reading, because they also play out even in today's international relations and the India-China contest that goes on after so many years, after 55 years of the 62 war. Essentially, the 62 clash was a culmination of what was actually a contest between two civilizations. There is enormous cultural differences between the Chinese approach to realpolitik and to war and conflict, and the Indian approach to realpolitik and war and conflict, which he brings out very clearly. the internal dynamics that came into play in Mao taking the decision. There were starvation deaths. There was cannibalism, for instance, he points out in the late 50s and early 60s in China, which was also, which sort of propelled him to have a diversionary kind of a tactic to attack India. Several aims came together in launching the attack on India in 62. Interestingly, he also speaks about, and this is where I have personally seen the Chinese origin people in Assam, especially in Lido and Margarita and all those places, where those of the very innocent common citizens of Chinese origin were victimized. They were taken to the Devli camp in Rajasthan for a number of years. In fact, as late as 2013, I happened to be there back again, and we were doing election coverage. And I sort of came across this whole set of families who speak Assamese perhaps more fluently than, they perhaps have forgotten Mandarin or Cantonese that they had learned. So they speak Assamese. They are very much part of the Assamese society in Upper Assam, in Dibrugarh, in Margarita, in Lido, and in those places in Duliajan. So that was an interesting human aspect of the fallout of the 1962 war. So perhaps one of the other things that we need to now look at very carefully when we look back 55 years later is it the right time to declassify the much hyped Henderson-Brooks Bhagat report? Because it was based on the leak of that report, parts of those reports that Maxwell sort of extrapolated in the way that he wanted it. So perhaps I think the government needs to look at whether it's time maybe to frame a policy to declassify papers after a certain number of years. Maybe that Bhagat Brooks report needs fresh air rather than being in two cupboards of the Military Operations Directorate and the Defense Secretary's Almirah. It needs to be read a little more widely by common people. And therefore, I think one of the things that this book could do is to force more and more scrutiny of what happened in that decade. The other thing, finally, I want to say is, given his experience and given his previous books, and we always looked up to him, his travels in the Northeast, in the wilds of Northeast, we tried to emulate BErtil in that sense. Some of us did succeed walking with the militants, walking with the militant groups, going across to Burma and living with them sometimes. This book should bring back, and the government of India is doing a lot of it. The governments in Northeast are doing a lot of work there. But perhaps in popular perception in the rest of India, Northeast needs to be looked at with fresh perspective, and Northeast needs to be looked at as a bridge to Southeast Asia rather than the end of the road of the Indian highway going from Calcutta to maybe Imphal or Moreh. Or rather than that, we should look at it as the starting point of India's what used to be Look East policy, now Act East policy, maybe implement East policy as we go along. With that, I think this is a wonderful book, both rich in its research, authentic and very detailed research, and the anecdotal way in which it has been presented, which to a journalist or a lapsed journalist like me appeals much more. And therefore, it's been a wonderful read. I read it in about 3 days on various flights in the last, very easy read, which is what one likes as a journalist. We don't have the attention span of the research scholars. So therefore, I must say that this book will do very well, BErtil, and I wish you all the best in the journey forward. Thank you very much.